Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Fran, and I want to spend some time talking about the prophets this week. We are going to cover two different aspects of the prophets. We're going to cover the former prophets, or if you want to use this term, earlier prophets in Scripture, and the later prophets. So the former prophets are going to be the prophets that happened before Israel received a king. And then once the kingdom has split, then we're going to cover the later prophets. This portion of our former prophets video, this will be on Joshua and Judges, and I will have separate videos for each of these sections. And so you'll see them to be much shorter videos, maybe 7 to 10 minutes. It'll be easier for you to watch, and you'll be able to take a little bit at a time as you watch it throughout the week. So let me just remind you of the major sections of the Old Testament. Of course, as we compare, and I mentioned this during week 1 and 2, if you compare the English canon to the Hebrew canon, the Pentateuch and the Torah are in the same place. They're first, but the English canon, the English division of the Bible, separates the prophets quite a bit more in the writings. We have actually the historical books, which the Hebrews, of course, consider the prophets. And also we have the poetry and wisdom books, which they consider the writings. Then we go on even further to call it the major prophets and the minor prophets. Now, why do we do that? The major prophets were the ones where the chapters were much, much longer. We'll talk about that in a later video. They were very vital to the people of Israel, but that doesn't mean that the minor prophets were minor. And by no means are they minor. They just had much shorter books and much shorter record of their ministry. So we separate it a little bit differently than the Hebrews do. It doesn't mean that it's any different in terms of our understanding, but certainly we look at the Hebrew canon and it's much simpler. It's the Torah, the prophets, or the Torah is the law, right? The Pentateuch, the prophets, and the writings. So let's just remember also ourselves of the basic storyline of history. If you recall, God made promises to Abraham, and what was the promise? That he will be blessed by many people, his people. His descendants will as numerous as sands of the seashore, stars in the sky. He will be blessed with the land, and he will be a blessing to the nations. And so these were promises and a covenant that God made with Abraham as he goes about living his life into the land of Canaan that he would enter. Many of these promises were yet to be fulfilled, but several of them were partially fulfilled in Israel's history. And we saw this happen really with Solomon and David, and we're going to get into that a little bit, where David and Solomon built the temple. David began the acquiring of everything. Solomon built this magnificent temple and had this united kingdom, and everything was happening, and he was truly a blessing to the nations at that point in time. But Solomon sinned. He committed many sins. Many of it was pride. Others were marrying women who were number one, women, not woman, and also these were women who were from other cultures, other nations, and had false gods that they were worshiping, and drew him away. And so things unraveled. Eventually, the exile to Babylon happened, and the destruction of Jerusalem happened in 586 BC. And this is when the later prophets began to not just forthtell, but foretell. Forthtell means telling people about Scripture, about how they should live, right? Foretelling is to tell the future, what's going to happen, a future kingdom, a future time when things will be even better than David and Solomon's time. We do see that these promises were not fulfilled at that time, but they did give us a chance to see it start to get fulfilled in the New Testament, and then beyond that when Christ comes again. As we look at the Old Testament, again, the basic timeline takes us from the early history of man and man's interaction with God to the call of Abraham, all the way down to the restoration from captivity and that period of silence from 400 BC to 6 BC of nothing happening with prophets or the Old Testament until Jesus came. So that's a little bit of a review. Now, let's talk a little bit about Joshua. Now, of course, the people of Israel have gone through the wilderness. They had sinned. They didn't enter the promised land like they should have. They sent spies. The spies argued with each other, and 10 of them said, "Let's not go," and 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, "We can take this." Well, the people said, "We're not going to do this," and so they paid the price for it in wandering the wilderness for a full generation. So the second generation now, their children, were able to realize the promise of the land. And so Joshua details that conquest of the land that they entered in Canaan. And so we see the first 12 chapters where we see Israel's conquest of the land, and then we see the way that the land was divided according to all of the kingdoms and the tribes. And then how in 23 and 24, which is really part of your reading, a really important reading, Joshua is renewing his covenant. He is forthtelling. He's telling them about themselves. He's being a prophet here, forthtelling the covenant between Israel and God. And one of the things he says is, you can choose for yourselves who you may serve, okay? And he says, whether it's the gods of the Amorites or the Canaanites or the Perizzites, and he keeps going on and say that. And then he says, you can choose for yourself who you serve, but for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so he gives them an ultimatum, a point of choosing of who they would choose. And the people chose, of course, God at that point. There's some themes in Joshua, that there's a leadership succession from Moses to Joshua. He was a servant of Moses, and now he's a servant of the Lord. He was Joshua's second in command in so many ways, and then he ended up being really the person who led Israel. We begin to see the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham, where God's people start to fill the land. Yet we saw idolatry that continued on and remained in the land of Canaan, and so this is a sign of things to come. Okay, Joshua, in so many ways, you could say he's Moses 2.0. This is what he says in Joshua 1:5, that no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. I'm Moses again, in a way. Joshua 5:15, the commander of the Lord's armies said, take the sandals off from your feet. The place where you're standing is holy ground. Joshua did so. This is just like Exodus chapter 3, when Moses sees the burning bush, and God out of the burning bush said the same thing to Moses. He is so many ways Moses 2.0. As we look at the conquests, and you can look at this slide on your own, but we see the conquest of Israel entering the promised land. The highlight, I think, you would say, is chapter 8, when we see the first Jericho is destroyed and taken over. The walls come down miraculously, but they rededicate themselves to the covenant in chapter 8, verses 30 through 35. And they continue this and finish conquesting the land all the way up until chapter 12, where they begin to apportion the land to the different tribes and eventually to the clans. So it says right here in Joshua 21 how the Lord gave to Israel all the land. Summary statement that he swore that he would give to their fathers. So we have the conquest in Joshua, and we see the promises that God is giving to Joshua in achieving this conquest. And the promises is something that would apply to us today. Be strong and courageous, right? Be strong and courageous. You see this 3 times in this passage sitting right here. No man should be able to stand before you all your days of your life. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous. And so Joshua is being encouraged not to fear, because God is with him. And so we see Joshua being strong and being courageous, and even encouraging the people of Israel to do the same thing. 23 and 24 of those chapters, he's laying out the covenant. He's telling them about the law of Moses. He's remembering God's faithfulness in the past, and he's telling them, choose whom you will serve. Then we move on to Judges. Now, as Joshua was a great account of Israel's faithfulness, Judges is a horrible account of Israel's unfaithfulness. And so you see that Joshua dies, and Judges begins where the people just basically they do what's right in their own eyes, and you hear this over and over again in Judges. And then there's a partial conquest that takes place, but then they go to idolatry, and God sends a suppressor, and a suppressor comes, and then Israel prays and they ask for rescue, and God sends them from among them somebody that's a judge, meaning a rescuer. And so then they deliver the people of Israel from the oppressor, and then it goes back to the same thing. They start getting into idolatry again, and over and over and over again they fall into idolatry. Then they pray for a judge or a rescuer. God sends them a judge. The judge rescues them. And then everything's good, and then they fall into idolatry again, and it's just on and on and on and on. It's just ridiculous to say, why can't these people learn? Why can't we learn, right? But the people of Israel are certainly not learning their lesson. There are two tales, and by the way, this does show the need for a king, even though the people of Israel were supposed to have the king, the ultimate king, God the King. In chapter 17, there's an example of a priest who is from 17 through 21, who is an unfaithful priest, and so you see an example of that. But there's a huge outrage in chapter 19. If you want to look at it and read it, it's really worth your reading to look at this. It basically involves a concubine getting killed. It's really messed up. The guy leaves his concubine outside, and she's violated, and she's killed. She dies. Why did he leave her outside? It was messed up. He shouldn't have done it, right? But what happens is, because of that, the people of Israel ended up going to war against the tribe of Benjamin, who was responsible for the killing of this woman, violating her and killing her. And so it tells you that there needed to be stability in there. And because they weren't faithful to the ultimate king, God of the universe, it was their hardness of their heart that demanded a need for a little k, not a big K king, but a little k king on earth. This is a highlight of what the dangers are of idolatry. We all have our idols, whether it's money or possessions, but in this case they were worshiping false gods, and they were turning away from the God. And so this becomes a major theme in the book of Judges, and it also leads to another theme, and that is how merciful and patient God is. And that there's a need for a king, but not just a little king, a little k king, an ultimately righteous, godly king that we will see one day in King Jesus. So as we look at Judges, and we look a little more in the chapter by chapter, I won't get into it too much, but you'll see that it continues off of what Joshua was, until it gets to how unfaithful the people were. And because they were unfaithful, because they were worshiping and doing things what was right in their own eyes, God raised these judges. Now, what's a judge? We think of a judge as somebody sitting at the court and deciding what's right and wrong. A judge was that in that day, but he was also very much a leader over the people to lead them to righteousness. He didn't just say, this is how it should be. He said, this is how it should be, and come on, I'll take you there. And so you see these different examples. And by the way, I will point out that Deborah is a female judge. And we see others in here who were not the best of examples of character. Samson which some of you know. Samson was not a good guy and messed up quite a bit. And so the judges were by no means perfect, but they were what God used at that point in time, and God can use anything. Three major issues of Judges. Again, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king of Israel. They would say that over and over again. And people did what was evil in the sight of God. That's Joshua. That is Judges. We're going to move on to the next chapters or the next books as we continue to look at the former prophets. Thanks.